The architecture of the Renaissance. Time: 1400 to 1700 AD. Place: Italy. Outline: First is time and place. Second, socio-historical background. Under that is Vitruvius and the lessons of Greece and Rome and the humanities. Third, new technologies and inventions. Under that is the invention of perspective and a new way of thinking. Fourth, the characteristics of Renaissance architecture. Fifth, Giorgio Vasari and the White. Sixth, Renaissance architects and their works. Seventh is the Renaissance in France and England. Time and place: the Renaissance, in Italian Rinascimento, from re which means again, and nascere which means be born, was a cultural movement that spanned roughly from the 14th century to the 17th century, beginning in Florence in the late Middle Ages and later spreading to the rest of Europe. Spanned from 1400 to 1700 AD. Country of Italy, the city-states of Florence, Venice, and Milan, and Mantua. Florence was considered as the birthplace of Renaissance. The Renaissance begins in Italy as a cultural movement. It encompassed a resurgence of learning based on classical sources, the development of linear perspective in painting, gradual but widespread educational reform. Vitruvius' 10 books of architecture, the Architectura, or in English, On Architecture. 1487, the ancient text of Vitruvius was one of the first books printed. The impact of printing was tremendous. The architectural theorists of the revived antique style, such as Alberti, Cirillo, Francesco di Giorgio, Palladio, all wrote treatises that owed something to Vitruvius. The architect was not just putting up buildings, he was following a theory. Here is the background of Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, born 80 to 70 BC, died after 15 BC. He was a Roman writer, architect, and engineer, active in the 1st century BC. He is best known as the author of the multi-volume work De Architectura, or On Architecture. Vitruvius is famous for asserting in his book De Architectura that a structure must exhibit the three qualities of firmitas, utilitas, venustas, that is, it must be solid, useful, and beautiful. These are sometimes termed the Vitruvian virtues or the Vitruvian triads. The Vitruvian man. Rather than using the complex geometric transformations of medieval master masons, Renaissance architects favored simple forms such as circles and squares. They made drawings of the human figure inscribed within the basic outline of a circle and a square, thereby demonstrating that the human proportions reflected divine ratios. On the left is a Vitruvian man made by the famous Leonardo da Vinci. Brunelleschi's discovery of perspective. Filippo Brunelleschi (1377 to 1446). A Florentine goldsmith, Brunelleschi moved to Rome and visited the ancient ruins. Brunelleschi codified the principles of geometrically accurate linear perspective. This discovery had a profound effect of art, architecture, and civic design during and after Renaissance. The periods of Renaissance and the architects. Early Renaissance (1400s to 1500s), Brunelleschi Alberti. High Renaissance (1500 to 1525), Bramante. Late Renaissance (1525 to 1600), Palladio. Characteristics of Renaissance architecture. Style places emphasis on symmetry, proportion, geometry, and the regularity of parts as they are demonstrated in the architecture of classical antiquity, and in particular ancient Roman architecture, of which many examples remained. Planar or flat classicism. Renaissance architecture tends to feature planar classicism or flat classicism. In other words, the walls of Renaissance buildings, both exterior and interior, are embellished with classical motifs of minor physical depth, such that they intrude minimally on two-dimensional appearance of the walls. On the right is the facade of St. Peter Basilica, Rome. Planar classicism. One of the examples is the Church of Jesus, Rome, 1568. The Mother Church of the Society of Jesus, a Roman Catholic religious order. Also, building types. The foremost Renaissance building types were the church, palazzo, or urban mansion, and villa, or country mansion. While various great names are associated with the Renaissance church and the palazzo design, the most famous villa architect by far is Andrea Palladio. In England, large residences were called Elizabeth country houses. In France, they were called chateaux. Characteristics: inspired by Roman buildings, orderly arrangements of columns, pilasters, and lintels, as well as the use of semicircular arches, hemispherical domes, niches, edicules, replaced the more complex proportional system and irregular profiles of the medieval buildings. An example of this is the Palazzo Risolia, Florence, 1446 to 1451. Here are the elements of Renaissance architecture. Plans: square symmetrical appearance in which proportions are usually based on a module. Facades: symmetrical around their vertical axis. Domestic buildings are often surmounted by a cornice. Columns and pilasters: the Roman orders of columns are used. These are Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite. Arches are semicircular. Vaults do not have ribs. Domes is used frequently both as very large structural feature that is visible from the exterior. Here are some examples of floor plans from the Renaissance period. First is the Basilica di Santa Maria del Fiore, or the Florence Cathedral. Second is the plan of Chateau de Chambord, France, 1519 to 1527. And lastly is the plan of St. Peter's Basilica, Rome, by Bramante, 17th century. Here is the facade of the Palladian Villa. Symmetrical around their vertical axis, domestic buildings like this are often surmounted by a cornice. These are the characteristics of architectural elements. Ceilings. Roofs are fitted with flat or coffered ceilings, frequently painted or decorated. Doors usually have square lintels set within an arc or surmounted by a triangular or segmental pediment. In the Mannerist period, the Palladian arc was employed. Walls are generally highly finished ashlar masonry laid in straight courses. The corners of the buildings are often emphasized by the rustication coins. Base, basements and ground floors were often rusticated. Windows may be paired and set with a semicircular arc. They may have square lintels and triangular or segmental pediments, which are often used alternately. Details: moldings and all decorative details are carved with a great precision. Mastering the details of ancient Romans was one of the most important aspects of Renaissance theory. Moldings stand out around the doors and windows rather than being recessed as in Gothic architecture. Sculptured figures may be set in niches or placed with plinths. Here are examples of roofs that are fitted with flat or coffered ceilings frequently painted. On the right is the Pantheon, Rome. Left, interior of Basilica di San Andrea de Mantova, Mantua, Lombardy, Italy, 1462. And lastly is Galleria Farnese with vault ceiling, decorated by Annibale Carracci. Here is the facade of Santo Agostino, Rome, Giacomo de Pietrasanta, 1483, which have doors that show square lintels set within an arc or surmounted by a triangular segmental pediment. On the left is the Palazzo Medici Riccardi, Michelezzo di Bartolomeo, and on the top is the coining on the corners of Palazzo Aragano Gonzaga, Rome. It shows the external walls are generally of highly finished ashlar masonry laid in straight courses. Wall rustication. A popular decorative treatment of the Renaissance palazzo was rustication, in which a masonry wall is textured rather than smooth. This can entail leaving grooves in the joints between smooth blocks, using roughly dressed blocks, or using blocks that have been deliberately textured. The rustication of Renaissance palazzo is often differentiated between stories. Windows may be paired and set within a semicircular arc. They may have square lintels and triangular or segmental pediments, which are often used alternately. In this picture, it shows Palazzo Farms by Antonio de Sangro the Younger, Rome, Italy, 1570. Details: courses and moldings. All decorative details are carved with great precision. Some examples are Ovolo, Otophagus, Cyma recta, Taurus, Caveto. The architects of the Renaissance: Filippo Brunelleschi, 1377 to 1446; Michelozzo de Bartolome, 1396 to 1472; Leon Battista Alberti, 1404 to 1472; Donato Bramante, 1444 to 1514; Andrea Palladio, 1508 to 1580; Giacomo de Vignola, 1507 to 1573; Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1475 to 1564. Giorgio Vasari and the White, born on 30th of July 1511, died on 27 June 1574, was an Italian painter, writer, historian, and an architect, who is famous today for his biographies of Renaissance artists, considered the ideological foundation of art historical writing. As the first Italian art historian, he initiated the genre of an encyclopedia of artistic biographies that continue to today. Vasari coined the term Renaissance in print, though an awareness of the ongoing rebirth in the arts had been in the air from the time of Alberti. Vasari's L'État depuis Antiquité was first published in 1550. Filippo Brunelleschi, 1377 to 1446, was one of the foremost architects and engineers of the Italian Renaissance. He is perhaps the most famous for his discovery of perspective and for engineering the dome of the Florence Cathedral, but his accomplishments also include other architectural works, sculpture, mathematics, engineering, and even ship design. The Florence Cathedral Dome, 1436, by Filippo Brunelleschi, drew upon his knowledge of ancient Roman construction as well as lingering Gothic traditions to produce an innovation synthesis. Employed the Gothic pointed arc cross-section instead of a semicircular one. To reduce dead load, he created double shell as was done in Pantheon. Employed 24 vertical ribs and 5 horizontal rings of sandstone as observed in the ruins of Rome construction. The Foundling Hospital by Filippo Brunelleschi, often considered as the first building of the Renaissance. Foundling Hospital, 1421 to 1444, featured a continuous arcade. At the hospital, the arcading is three-dimensional, creating a loggia with domed vaults in each bay. Use of Corinthian columns across its main facade and around an internal courtyard. The design was based on Roman architecture. Other Brunelleschi's projects: Pazzi Chapel, 1460. The facade was inspired by the Roman triumphal arch. San Lorenzo, Florence, 1430 to 33. This church is seen as one of the milestones of Renaissance architecture, with Petra Serena or dark stone articulation. Michelozzo di Bartolomeo, 1396 to 1472, architect and sculptor. He was born on the year of 1396 and 1472. The Palazzo Medici is a Renaissance palace located in Florence. Bartolomeo was a student of Brunelleschi. The palazzo was influenced by the Foundling Hospital, used the arcaded courtyard of the hospital for the design. Leon Battista Alberti, 1404 to 1472, author, artist, architect, poet, priest, linguist, philosopher, cryptographer, the general Renaissance humanist, polymath. Leon Battista Alberti, a classical theorist who saw architecture as a way to address societal order, defined the Renaissance architect as a universalist, an intellectual, a man of genius, and a consort to those in position of power and authority. He himself was a Renaissance man. He worked in Rome after his studies in Florence, where he had many opportunities to see the monuments of antiquities, as well as meet the artists who were visiting them. Alberti studied the writings of the classical world like Plato, Aristotle, Plutarch, and Pliny the Elder. He wrote De la Pittura, or On Painting, where it included Brunelleschi's theories of perspective, and De Re Edificatoria on building, the first architectural treatise of the Renaissance. The Palazzo Rucellai, 1446 to 1451, was the first building to use classical orders on a Renaissance domestic building. San Maria Novella was the first complete design for a church facade in the Renaissance. Alberti linked the lower aisle roof to the pediment higher nave with flanking scrolls.